has led scientists to turn to an unusual ally in the fight to limit the effects of climate change. We're talking about the largest rodent in North America, the beaver.
When a once thriving desert river started to fade into dust, scientists found themselves facing a challenge no dam or irrigation system could solve. In a surprising move, the U.S. released thousands of beavers into the dry landscape, hoping these determined animals might succeed where human efforts had failed. At first, people were doubtful. Beavers? In the desert? But as time went on, something unexpected began to happen along the cracked, dry riverbanks. Water started showing up in places that had been dry for decades, and stretches of land seemed to come alive again. This isn't a story about wishful thinking or instant miracles. It's a true look at what nature can do when given a little push. And 2 years later, what happened surprised just about everyone. So why send thousands of beavers? Imagine a stretch of desert in southern Idaho and northern Utah, where a once lively river had become little more than a trickle through mud and rock. Groundwater levels kept dropping. Fish vanished. Areas that had once been full of life turned to dust. Locals had tried everything, building new dams upstream, tightening irrigation use, but nothing brought the river back. Then someone had an idea that sounded almost too simple. What if beavers could do what concrete hadn't? Beavers, often called nature's engineers, do more than just build dams. They reshape entire ecosystems. Their dams slow down water, raise the water table, and help bring back plants, bugs, and animals. For officials trying to save these dying rivers, this wasn't just moving wildlife around. It was using a living, breathing tool for restoration. But not everyone was convinced. Hydrologists worried the harsh desert climate would be too much. Farmers were afraid the beaver dams might flood their land or mess up the flow of irrigation water. Even some biologists wondered if the animals could survive long enough to make a difference. In many spots, there was barely a trickle of water left during the hottest months. Still, the first releases went ahead, quietly but with purpose. Beavers were brought in by helicopters and trucks, placed in key dry spots along the river. The goal wasn't to fix the whole system overnight. It was to see if small groups could slow erosion and keep enough water around to support new growth. Those early days were hit or miss. Some beavers disappeared, likely moving off into land too dry to support them. But others stayed and slowly began doing what beavers have always done. Small dams started to appear. Pools got deeper. New willows sprouted where nothing had grown in years. The team kept expectations low. No one promised to bring back the whole river or restore entire forests. They just looked for small signs: slower water runoff, cooler temperatures in summer, tiny wetlands forming in spots that had been bone dry. Doubters kept watching, expecting it all to fall apart. But the story was only just getting started. And over the next 2 years, what unfolded was beyond anything they'd imagined. The first signs of change didn't take long to show up. Just months after the U.S. released thousands of beavers into the dry landscape, things on the desert floor started shifting. Dams made of sticks, mud, and rocks appeared in places where the river had nearly disappeared. Behind these little dams, shallow pools began to form, some barely ankle deep, others deep enough to reflect the cliffs in the distance. The water, which used to rush away too fast to be useful, now slowed down. As each pool grew, sediment settled and water soaked sideways into the dry ground, soil that hadn't felt moisture in years. It didn't take fancy tools to notice the difference, but scientists had come prepared. They'd buried groundwater sensors in the sand, dropped temperature trackers into the new pools, and used aerial photos to watch from above. Early data matched what locals were already seeing. Groundwater started rising, just a few inches, but enough to keep parts of the riverbank damp well into the day. For nearby farmers and ranchers who had watched the river disappear, it felt strangely emotional. Dry creek beds that hadn't held water in years now showed little trickles that stayed even after sunrise. One rancher who had laughed off the whole idea found himself standing beside a pool where frogs now sang in the evening. "I didn't think it would work," he said. But then one day, Water showed up where no one had seen it in decades. The changing landscape started to show traces of the past, old river paths and bends that water seemed eager to fill again, like it still remembered the way. Seeds blown in by the wind stuck in the muddy edges of the new dams and started to grow. Young willows and cottonwoods sent up green shoots, their roots soaking up the fresh groundwater. Birds that used to be rare started returning, resting and nesting near the pools, while insects buzzed above the still water. The changes weren't perfect or even. Some beaver dams were washed out during sudden desert storms. Some beaver groups didn't last in areas where food was too hard to find. But even with those setbacks, what stayed was enough to shift doubt into hope. One hydrologist who had warned the plan might fail found herself crossing out her own predictions. The beavers adapted faster than we thought, and so did the land. From a science angle, it wasn't surprising that beavers built dams. That's just what they do. The real surprise was how quickly those dams popped up across miles of dried riverbed. By slowing the water, they trapped sediment that would have just washed away. The desert floor, once hard and cracked like stone, softened as water crept below the surface. Even from satellite images, thin green lines began to trace the shape of the river again, like someone had quietly redrawn it. People nearby said it more simply. "It's like someone turned back time," one longtime resident said, pointing at the cattails now growing along a creek that had been dry for as long as he could remember. Kids played near the pools that had been empty when their parents were their age. Even small pools made a difference, because where there's water, there's life. And life brings more life. Experts stayed cautious in their official reports, knowing that nature rarely follows a script. But privately, a few began to admit they were surprised. A plan that had sounded desperate at the start was actually working, at least for now. And so, just months into what many had dismissed as a long shot, there was clear, measurable change. What those thousands of beavers were building wasn't just a bunch of dams. It was the start of something much bigger, something that 2 years later would leave people truly amazed. Wildlife returns. By the time a full year had passed since beavers were reintroduced to the desert, something remarkable was happening. Sure, the water had transformed the landscape, but it was what the water brought back that stunned even the experts. At first, things changed slowly. But then, almost like the land itself was racing to catch up, life returned. Beaver ponds turned into shallow wetlands, and frogs began singing again in places where their calls hadn't been heard for decades. Insects followed, the air filled with dragonflies, damselflies, and beetles hovering in glimmering clouds. They laid eggs in water that hadn't existed a year earlier. Small fish, probably carried downstream as eggs or larvae, showed up in the deeper pools. No one had expected fish to bounce back this quickly, but there they were, darting under algae and floating twigs. And with the fish came birds. Herons started wading through the pools, hunting what the scientists hadn't even counted on. Ducks began nesting in the reeds now lining the edges. Swallows zipped across the water's surface, chasing insects at dusk. Even hawks and eagles were seen overhead, circling slowly, drawn by the promise of life below. Rabbits and mice followed, finding shelter in the green corridors that now traced the streams. "It's happening faster than we dared hope," one ecologist said, standing beside a beaver dam so neatly built it was hard to believe it hadn't come from human hands. But it wasn't just about the animals. The beaver dams were also doing quiet work under the surface. They trapped silt and slowed down water enough for seeds to take root along the banks, places that used to be scoured clean by flash floods. Soon, young willows and cottonwoods were growing again, along with patches of wild grasses. Their roots held the soil in place, helping it stay put. As the plants grew, they added shade. That shade cooled the ponds, letting the water last longer during the hottest months. Each season, the green border around the streams got wider, stretching out into the land and forming a ribbon of life through the dusty channel. Deer began visiting the new water to drink and rest, their hoofprints pressed into the soft mud where only sand had been. Coyotes followed, not in large numbers, but enough to show that a true ecosystem was coming back. Nature doesn't return in pieces, it comes back as a whole, with each part pulling the next along. The soil, once pale and dry, now turned darker, rich with leaves and animal droppings. The sharp, dry smell of dust was replaced with something more earthy, hints of wet soil and fresh growth. Even locals who had believed in the project from the start were taken aback by how quickly the desert began to feel alive again. A rancher remembered it clearly. "We thought it'd take 10 years, maybe longer. But those beavers worked non-stop, and once the water stayed, everything else just started showing up." What came next wasn't as easy to see, but it mattered just as much. As plants held the soil in place, fewer nutrients washed away during rains, and the clearer water made a better home for fish and bugs. The beaver ponds acted like natural filters, letting groundwater recharge deeper and more slowly than any human-made canal ever had. Small animals and reptiles started showing up in the new brush, filling in the gaps of a food chain that had been missing for years. For scientists who had been watching all this carefully, the message was humbling. One species, just by doing what it was made to do, had sparked a comeback that no expert, with all their maps and models, had been able to fully imagine. It wasn't perfect. Some dams failed. Some animals moved on. But the overall trend was clear: impact on local communities. While biologists tracked the comeback through data and graphs, the people living closest to the water felt the changes in a more personal way. For farmers and ranchers who had worked this land for generations, the arrival of thousands of beavers wasn't just some odd government plan. It became part of their lives. 2 years later, even folks who'd been the most doubtful were saying the same thing. They hadn't expected this. One of the first things people noticed was their wells. In areas where groundwater had been dropping for years, a few farmers reported that their water levels had steadied, or even risen a bit after the beavers moved in. It wasn't magic, and it didn't happen overnight. But as the beaver dams slowed and spread the water out, more of it soaked into the ground instead of rushing away. Some wells that had gone dry in late summer now held out a little longer. For ranchers trying to keep cattle watered and growers managing small plots, that change made a real difference. It meant fewer long nights worrying if pumps would fail or animals would run short. And it wasn't just about the wells. The land itself began to look different. People started noticing fewer washouts on back roads, and pastures that used to be full of deep ruts from storm runoff began to stay more stable. Instead of dry washes turning into dangerous torrents after summer storms, the water flowed more gently, slowed by the patchwork of beaver dams upstream. Of course, not everything was easy. Living close to wildlife always brings a few headaches. Some landowners had to fix fences more often after beavers chewed through posts to drag them back to their ponds. A few fields near the streams lost young trees to hungry teeth. And in some spots, new ponds stretched out into grazing areas, cutting into space meant for livestock. As one rancher put it, they don't ask permission, they just build. Still, even he admitted the issues, though real, felt small compared to what had been gained. People who had grown up beside a dying river found themselves talking about it differently now. They brought the river back, a local store owner said. Parents pointed out frogs and turtles to their kids, creatures they hadn't seen since their own childhoods. School field trips began stopping by the beaver sites, using them to teach how just one species could reshape an entire landscape. Tourism saw a quiet lift, too. Nature lovers, bird watchers, and curious visitors started showing up on weekends to walk near the ponds, always careful not to disturb anything. Small businesses began offering cold drinks, hot meals, and even guided walks, bringing in a few extra dollars to towns that had long relied almost only on farming. Locals who had once rolled their eyes at the idea of beavers becoming a tourist draw now found themselves answering questions from travelers with a kind of quiet pride. For the experts studying the project, these local stories often meant the most. Sure, the reports had plenty of charts showing sediment drop and water recharge, but hearing someone say, "My granddad never thought he'd see this stream running again," That's what really captured what had changed. Over time, the beavers became more than a conservation tool. They became a symbol, part of the community itself. A reminder that even in a place labeled as past its prime, something strong and hopeful could still take root and grow. By the end of the second year, not everything was figured out. People were still discussing how to manage things long-term and how to balance cattle grazing with expanding wetlands. But one thing was certain: the numbers that came next shocked just about everyone. Another number that caught attention came from wildfire experts. Before the project, dry stream beds lined with brittle grass had been known fire hazards. But now, the soaked soils and beaver ponds acted as natural fire breaks, keeping moisture in the land longer during peak heat. Satellite data even showed a drop in fire risk in areas where beaver activity was strong. It wasn't a cure for wildfire risk, but it was a buffer. And it hadn't been built by machines or chemicals, but by animals quietly doing what they'd always done. These weren't just numbers buried in research papers. Analysts looking at the total impact began to rethink what big restoration projects could look like, especially in dry regions. One hydrologist, in a rare moment during an interview, said it plainly: "We underestimated what thousands of beavers working together could do. We expected small, local changes. But the network effect? That went way beyond our models." The lesson became clear. One beaver dam might slow down water. But when thousands were built across hundreds of miles, the entire flow of the region shifted. The recovery also revealed something deeper, something about patience and time. Engineers used to fast fixes and hard concrete had just watched nature take its time and still deliver big results in only a couple of years. No massive dams, no drilling, just countless small ponds, sticks, and mud reversing decades of decline in places long thought lost. As one analyst reviewing the final report put it, "The desert isn't what we thought it was, and neither are the beavers." What happens next? After 2 years of unexpected success, the big question stopped being, did it work? And became, where else? The results: rising water tables, the return of animals, and the simple feeling that the desert was alive again, pushed agencies and restoration planners to start thinking ahead. Could this model, the one that brought back a dying river, be used in other places? Early talks focused on other dry watersheds across the West, small desert rivers and seasonal streams that had faded after years of drought, overuse, and a shifting climate. These areas faced the same issues: fast-draining rainwater, disappearing wetlands, and sinking groundwater. The hope was that if beavers could bring one river back, maybe they could do it again elsewhere, not with big construction, but with natural engineering. Still, even as new maps were drawn up, no one wanted to oversell the idea. Long-term planning brought up some real concerns. Beavers can grow their numbers fast, sometimes faster than the land can handle. Left alone, they might flood fields, back up roads, or spread into private land. Wildlife teams would need to stay involved, steering some colonies, moving families when needed, and finding a balance between nature's pace and people's needs. And there was still climate to think about. The rivers chosen so far had at least some water year-round, enough to keep beavers alive. But in even drier places, the challenge would be tougher. Beavers can work wonders, but only if there's just enough water to work with. In the driest basins, where rivers only run for a few months each year, some tough questions remained. Would beavers even have enough water to survive, let alone build? And if long droughts stretched on, could even the most resilient colony keep going? Hydrologists started running worst-case scenario models. As adaptable as beavers are, they still can't work with water that simply isn't there. At the same time, community concerns were real. Farmers and ranchers who had seen clear benefits still worried about their fences, their fields, and the risk of future flooding. Wildlife agencies responded by hosting public meetings, sharing plans for ongoing monitoring, relocation steps, and compensation options for unexpected losses. Trust didn't happen overnight, but it started to grow. Not every worry could be solved, but people felt heard, and that made a difference. Beyond these local talks, a bigger conversation was forming. What if beavers weren't just pests to manage, but real partners in fighting drought? What began as a small, hopeful test started to feel like a shift in thinking, using native wildlife not just to protect fragile places, but to help heal them. No concrete, no massive pumps, just teeth, mud, and instinct passed down for generations. To many ecologists, it was a humbling lesson, a reminder that natural systems, given the right push, can sometimes repair what human engineering can't. And it gave policymakers something to think about. Maybe the best solutions aren't always the newest. The speed of recovery in that first river valley proved something important. Even in dry, damaged places, resilience is still possible. By the end of year 2, new funding proposals were already in motion. Pilot projects were being planned in Nevada, Arizona, and parts of eastern Oregon. Restoration teams mapped out promising rivers, worked with local residents, and built tools to track progress in real time. Each plan was careful, grounded in what had worked and what still needed solving. At the center of it all was one powerful idea, that the beaver, once nearly wiped out in the West, might help it thrive again. No one was calling it a guaranteed fix. Nature rarely makes promises. But the results of that first test made one thing clear. Sometimes the best answers don't come from new inventions, but from rediscovering old allies. As the planning turned into action, the legacy of those first thousands of beavers stood tall. Given a chance, nature had surprised everyone for all the right reasons. Pools came back to land that had only known dust. Wildlife returned. And communities felt the change in real ways. It's proof that even the most unlikely idea can spark something real, a living, breathing transformation. And it all started when the U.S. released thousands of beavers into a desert with a dying river and let them do what they've always done best. But what do you think? Could beavers really help bring life back to other dry lands around the world? Or was this a rare case of perfect timing and place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if this story inspired you, be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in the power of nature.